This lecture is about the relationship between anthropology and exoticization. And anthropology is the Western product, and so I'm interested in its relationship with Western exoticization. This is just to begin by saying that exoticization is not a specifically Western thing. All cultures have exoticized others in some way or another in history. But in sort of like the research that I've been doing, which is a little bit primal, if you like, on the history of exoticization, I kind of like discovered, funnily enough, that the first time the word exotic was used was by Rabelais in his book Car Livre, where he talks about marchandises exotiques et pérégrines, which is basically, he is describing in his novel, written in 1552, right? Descending into this imaginary port and being subjected to merchandise. The hero of the novel is subjected to this merchandise, which Rabelais describes as exotic and pérégrine, which is a bit, you know, like outlandish, kind of like out of, and he kind of not only describes that, which I found amazing because I went to the text a bit to look at, not that I have read the novel before, but I kind of like became interested to see. And he was actually kind of like critical of the culture of merchandise that is exotic, saying that in fact it's all allure, but in fact there was nothing. It's going to leave you dissatisfied in the end, which I thought was a pretty amazing thing to think with commodity, with notions of merchandise, and etc. But of course, there's big debates about whether we want to start the history of Western exoticization of otherness with the emergence of the term exotic, because you can argue that there has been exoticism well before the term exotic as such. And kind of very interestingly, this historian, Stéphanie Wekenier, who works on ancient Greeks' conceptions of Egypt, sort of like where Egypt was considered as tomato, which is land of wonders. And her definition really is like the very definition of the exotic, it seems to me. She says in the Herodotian Logos, it was defined as a land near and far, fascinating and disturbing, marvelous and picturesque, always identical and changing. And even though we're talking about ancient Greeks, it seems to me like a reasonably good definition of the exotic. So the depiction of the exotic that really becomes, in which anthropology becomes more inserted is, of course, colonial exoticization. But I just wanted to make sure we know that there is a pre-colonial history of exoticization. But it is important to see the difference, how exoticization starts to actually carry the mark of the relation of power that colonialism is. How it becomes imbued with colonial sense of power, and how the depictions, the exoticizations, sometimes it's very subtle, but you can see how the exoticization starts to include a form of possession, a form of, this is for me, a form that I can actually collect this. I can grab it. It is within my reach. All of these, to me, indicate a certain sense, sometimes very subliminal, of an otherness which is available to me, and that I can consume, I can collect in museums, etc. And I've referred to this kind of colonialism in the past as a form of colonial necrophilia, in the sense that there is in it a kind of love of the colonized the moment the colonized is basically killed, politically killed. You find even sometimes a direct correlation between the pacification of the colonized and the enjoyment of their exoticness. Sort of like the more they are passive, the more we can have sort of like art collections celebrating them. Sometimes we can even celebrate their resistance. Sometimes we can even celebrate their amazing capacity for survival. But all of this is post-assassination, political assassination, so to speak. So it is in this sense that colonialism introduces something quite unique in the history of exoticization. Aside, but maybe sometimes linked to colonialism, sometimes not linked to colonialism, is a kind of like exoticism as a desire for difference against modernist hegemony in general. You know, Baudelaire is an incredible example of this in his poem Anywhere Out of the World, which I say, n'importe où, anywhere but here, kind of like take me. And just coincidentally, I've got a Baudelaire verse here tattooed on my arm, which says, envole-toi bien loin de ces miasmes morbides, which is a classic case of it, which is, fly yourself far away from these morbid swamps. So this idea of, this is unbearable, I want to go somewhere. Now, its relation to colonialism is sometimes straightforward, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes you have to think that it's a condition of possibility is colonial, but it does not have any desire to hierarchize, to inferiorize in the way certain form of colonial exoticization exists. So it's important to remember, because I think anthropology in the end has quite a unique relation to this particular escapist form of exoticization. Now, it's very important to remember that when we are looking at this history of popular exoticization, all along, next to it, there's attempts of people to be closer to the facts, so to speak. You know, there's continuously sort of like diplomatic missions, sort of like people who are much more serious about otherness, etc. And so you have, against what I call the fabulators, there was always more empirically inclined people who went and wanted not just to have impressions of the exotic other, but wanted to construct, with hard labor, some knowledge about the other. It's a different kind of labor. I mean, interestingly, I read that even sort of like in 13th century Europe, when the Mongols were running sort of like, were powerful, and sort of like Asia was considered as mirabilia, which is the land of wonder, again, the land of wonder. And at that time, in the 13th century, There were Franciscan monks, etc., traveling in India, and further into China. And what I found interesting, and I put it kind of like, was that one of the most common sentences that you hear is, nothing indicates that. Nothing indicates that there are Amazons. Nothing indicates that there are giants. Nothing indicates. I mean, I think this idea of nothing indicates is very important because it sort of like captures that desire for the empirical, which I think is very important when we think histories of construction of otherness. So I want to highlight this, but I also want to highlight it as a particular form of labor. It's not just an attitude. It is not just some kind of like different way of seeing. It's people who are working. It takes time. It's a job. It's kind of like they do things. Accumulating actually empirical evidence is a form of labor. It's not just an attitude. And it is this kind of labor which I think most importantly one has to think that anthropology belongs to. Anthropology is not just an attitude to otherness. It is not just some kind of like way of conceiving otherness. It is a professionalization of the labor required to know the other seriously. So it involves a number of desires that come together in the West. The desire to know seriously the other. This is very important at a time when there was such frivolous kind of like conceptions that stayed with us even today in the history of multiculturalism, etc., where you think you have Thai food and you know Thai culture, etc. This idea that, well, you need to actually work hard to know otherness is very important. You have to work on it. I called it jokingly the professionalization of the sleepover because with my students, I kind of like say, okay, when was the first imaginary anthropological experience you've had, you think? And it's kind of like say, okay, I think it must be when you went on the sleepover. You went on the sleepover and you thought, gosh, look how they have breakfast. Gosh, look how they talk to their mom. Look how they talk to their dad. And when you go back home the next day and you start telling your mom, you should see how they do it. This is your first anthropological report. This is your first. And so it is this idea of crossing to a certain form of otherness, thinking it, reporting about it, etc. I wouldn't include it as labor here, I know, but still, it's a beginning for a child. Very importantly, I think what you have in this anthropological tradition is, on one hand, a tendency towards a sociology of otherness. That is, I move to the other, to the exotic other, to know the other, to know what are they like, what is their society, how is it constituted, rights, etc. But also there is a kind of like different activities that has always been part of the anthropological enterprise, which is not simply interested in how to know the society I have landed in, but rather maybe slightly more narcissistic, but I think quite interesting, which is, what the hell is happening to me here? I have crossed into a world where I am not in control of the symbolic order, where I don't know how to operate, where my habitus is not efficient. I cannot deploy myself efficiently into this world. Now, how do I find myself in this world? Now, all of this is not to say that anthropology, and it would be ridiculous to say it, is apart from the history of racism. It intersects. There's many of these attempts that intersect with racism, with colonial racism, etc. But it's important to try and capture still the distinctness of this labor that involves a relation with the exotic other. Of course, there's who studies whom, how it is structured. Why is it that it's always white people who go and study non-white people? That's structured. There's who can know whom, not just sort of like who studies, but who can know in terms of knowledge. There's the conditions of possibility of access. Who has access to otherness? There's the intellectual toolbox for thinking, the crossing itself. The whole toolbox is European thought with colonial tools. So indeed, one can say that the whole economic, political, institutional, and intellectual infrastructure of the anthropological crossing was colonial, white, and European in that history. But by emphasizing it as labor, I want to highlight the fact that, well, it's still a good thing. It's still a good thing that someone wants to do the crossing, even if it's a colonial, but you have to think it sometimes in abstract way. Is it nice to just want to know yourself, or is it nice to want to know others? This, in the abstract, has nothing to do with just white people. If you are Lebanese, if you are sort of like Native American, if you are Native Canadian, whoever you are, there's something which can be said, well, great if you want to know yourself, but it's good also if you cross to know others. And that enterprise of crossing to know others is, in a way, contained a certain sort of like dimension of anthropology. I'm not into normative statements, nor do I want to say this is what real anthropology is, but I want to say that this is a part of anthropology which is very valuable, which has a history which is worth continuing, interacting with, and reviving. This, in a sense, what I'm trying to attempt to highlight here. It's worth it. None of this, none of the colonial critique devalorizes the idea that it's good to want to know otherness seriously as opposed to superficially, that to engage in it, you need to cross your culture from your culture to another culture, that you need to professionalize. And then there's this question of professionalization, which is often absent from the debate completely, as if sort of like, I think what interestingly happened is that with Edward Said's critique, which was a very powerful critique, which showed that there was continuity between academic, artistic, popular. All of them had the print of sort of like Orientalism on them. That was, and you don't find it in Said, by the way, because Said, even though he says that, you can see that he is, when he is talking about certain anthropologists, certain sociologists, certain etc., he said, yeah, this bugger is a real bad Orientalist, but there was something really useful about what he did, or she did. Sort of like he goes through what the positivity of the knowledge created. But what we get later is something which I find probably at the core of a certain something which became a gain but also a loss, which is the idea of how people start to think about subject position. And they say, what is your subject position? Are you your colonial subject position? And the idea of subject position obviously is an important one to think through. What is your subject position? But the subject become labor-less. What kind of labor does the subject do? It's not enough to think you are in this. I might be in the same subject position as the guy who is cutting my hair, but we don't do the same kind of labor. And subject position is not enough. We want to go into what Marx would call the concrete labor of what we do as anthropologists. It's not the same concrete labor as the coiffeur, as whoever, as the artist, as etc. So, I want to celebrate with you someone who celebrated the crossing. And sort of like Lucien Levy-Bruhl is a very interesting character in the history of French anthropology, partly because he didn't do any ethnography. He is one of those pontificators sitting down in an office, gathering a lot of data and etc., and thinking with his data, but he's an anthropologist, not an ethnographer, but he's an anthropologist in the sense he did take the labor of others, the ethnography of others very seriously, and worked through it to produce something. And this something he called, very exotically, la mentalité primitive, primitive mentality. And you can imagine, primitive mentality, it's such a lovely ground to bash someone in these post-colonial days. Primitive and mentality, both of them are just like a ridiculous concepts from our standpoint today. Yet, for all this, I want to say is that Levy-Bruhl provides us with one of the key moments of this anthropology of crossing that no other initiated before him. First of all, he had, I love some of the things that he highlighted. One should not try and make transparent that which by its very nature is opaque. That's your flag. Notice this. Sort of like the gaze that is trying to kind of like simplify and make something which is opaque, sort of like is sometimes destructive. So for Levy-Bruhl, there was no necessity of a kind of like necessity of bulldozing everything with Western rational forensic mode of analysis. This is so crucial. We have to accept that when people say they are thinking, it does not mean that they are doing the same thing in all times and places. Let us be careful not to attribute to the primitives our own mental habits. Now, someone will read this and say, primitive, oh my God, he just said primitive, and forget about the fact that he said, let's not attribute to these people the same mental. That's also important. I mean, if you want to spend your time crying every time you hear primitive, go ahead. But I think there's other things that are important here to kind of like think about. You can do that and, you know, at least. And the thing is that, and this is, by the way, the basis of a very famous letter that Husserl wrote to Levy-Bruhl when precisely he said, gosh, I've been thinking about thinking for so long, thank you. With La Mentalité Primitive, you have actually offered me a way of thinking about thinking that I could not have thought before. So it is good to see that anthropology has something to offer philosophy. not always vice versa, as some people like to imagine that wisdom comes from philosophy and then we apply it as anthropologists. So that's important. Then he calls mystical mentality as an intellectual or affective mode of existence. Again, this is very interesting. What's an intellectual or affective mode? And he talks about how we're talking about a mode of knowledge that orients us in life rather than locates us. And how sort of like, and how it is important to try and empty yourself of your own concepts, to try and think what you don't have concepts for in a new way. This was also so crucial. And then you have something which every critic of Levy-Bruhl says, almost a desire for blindness in the way people deal with Levy-Bruhl here. His concept of l'enchevêtrement des réalités, the entanglement of realities. The fact that most realities are entanglement of the mystical and the non-mystical mode of existence. Everyone thinks Levy-Bruhl mystical here, non-mystical there. In fact, he thinks them as an entanglement. This is Levy-Bruhl. So about the primitives. In fact, they act as if they have full confidence, just as we do, in the constancy of the laws of nature and the permanence of the forms of living beings. They need to, in order to survive, and their techniques witness to this. I mean, the guy is there, there's houses. You can't build a house with a primitive mentality. I mean, you build a house knowing that the wood you have to, etc. Sort of like there is a very, but at the same time they have mystical experiences which reveal to them the presence of supernatural invisible forces. So from this perspective, the difference between this world and mystical world is only of the order of more or less. This is what's so crucial. For him, he is not saying that they are so mystical, we are so instrumental. He is saying their mystical model stands out here more than among ourselves. I mean, to show you the blindness, this is a letter that Levy-Bruhl wrote to Evans Pritchard. He says, I don't deny at all that mystical elements exist in the ways of thinking of English and French population. In highlighting the difference, I want to highlight the dominant traits, leaving the others in the shadows. Later, Evans Pritchard writes, Levy-Bruhl has written many volumes to prove that the savages are pre-logical in opposition to Europeans who are logical. I mean, like you read this and you think, well, which part you don't understand of the fact that I'm not making a polarity here? Which? You tell me. And so, but here we come to something quite essential in the relation between anthropology and exoticism as far as Levy-Bruhl is concerned, and for us, why I think? Because he said, there is a mystical mentality that is more easily demarcated and therefore more easily observable among the primitives than in our societies, but it is present in every human mind. It's present everywhere. This is where we get to the idea that the exotic is among us. It's not just over there. The exotic is among us. But what is here the important purpose of an anthropology of self-exoticization? One, ethnography becomes a honing of the senses that allows us to capture a certain mode of existence. That is, when I go to research among people who have a mystical mentality, my senses get more capable of capturing that mystical mentality. I develop a habitus, so to speak. This is a good ethnography gives you a capacity to capture things. Then you take this habitus that you have captured in your ethnography, and suddenly you start seeing it in your own space. That is, you transpose the habitus, and suddenly, this is what every anthropologist, sort of like of serious anthropologist of exotic otherness has done. You know, you can argue with them, sort of like, you know, from Ruth Benedict to Margaret Mead to whoever you want. You can say they have simplified, etc., but this is the move that they have done. They have highlighted something which they say stands out in the space where they're doing the ethnography, then come back and say, well, actually, now that I've done the ethnography, I can see it here. I can see it in my own life. You know, the most classical Marcel Mauss, Lodon, sort of like he says, there's society structured by the gift and society structured by commodities. I'm going to look at how exotic societies who are structured by gift exchange are, but then the book finishes with, actually, I can sniff giftness everywhere. I can actually look at my own society and see how the commodity form is not at all the only form, but in the commodity is an entanglement. It's entangled with the reality. So there's this thing which we call learning to see, but also learning to unsee, that involves sort of like the ethnography of self-ethnicization, and what we call also unknowing in order to see new. I'm going to take you to what I'm calling metaphoric exoticization. My friend Baudelaire, in this poem, captures very nicely what we are talking about here with a little twist. Notice how this poem begins. When with both my eyes closed, so the first act is the act of unseeing. I close my eyes. On a hot autumn night, inhale the fragrance of your warm breast. I inhale, so I capture now. I close my eyes and I capture with my senses. Inhale. I inhale. I see. Notice. I close my eyes. I use my senses. I see. And what I see is exotical. For Baudelaire, I see happy shores spread out before me on which shines a dazzling and monotonous sun, etc. So notice the structure of the experience here. Why do I call it metaphoric exoticization? Well, because the warm breast does not have a direct connection with the happy shores. It's just sexist bloody guy thinking the sort of like breast as some amazing sort of like invitation to the shores. So you can have actually a metonymic experience of exoticization. What is the metonym? If you know the difference between the metonymy and the metaphor, the metonymy object is part of what it is. It's an extension. So when you say an exotic fruit takes me to the island, that's metonymic because the fruit is from the island. So it's not a different order of reality representing another reality. So, but again, I close my eyes, I eat mango, and I have, you know, a mango, banana, coconut tree, and that's exotica from an experience of eating mangoes. I'm happy with this as a very simple and basic mode of how the production of exotic fantasies occurs. And I think that we, in anthropology, when we want to do this kind of anthropology. And again, I'm insisting, I'm not trying to define anthropology for you. This kind of anthropology that involves exoticization. We have to do this unseeing. Unseeing as a mode of seeing for the first time. But what does it mean, see for the first time? We have a name for it. It is first contact. It is, and in some ways, an anthropology of exoticization is an anthropology that aims to reproduce a state of first contact. What is first contact? I've never seen this before. Astonishing. It strikes me as amazing. We only think first contact, again, through its colonial trope, but there is an amazing childish wonder in the notion of first contact. There is an amazing thing of, wow, I've never seen this before. I've never encountered this before. I mean, this is also as important as the colonial thing. And indeed, André Gide, when he's looking at exoticism, he tells us ce qui fait le charme et l'attrait de l'ailleurs de ce que nous appelons exotisme, ce n'est point tant que la nature y soit plus belle, mais que tout nous y paraît neuf. Everything appears new to us. Nous surprend et se présente à notre œil dans une sorte de virginité. Virgin land. I'm sort of like encountering something for the first time. It's amazing. It's exotic. And so in order to be able to do this permanent state of encounter, this is a kind of labor that is anthropological labor. So let me give you an example minor example of how I kind of like taught myself to unsee something in my last book, Diasporic Condition, where for a very long time I worked, and I indeed published, a number of works on nostalgia, on diasporic nostalgia. 25 years ago, I published with what I consider a very classical paradigm. The idea of nostalgia as involving one, what I call now mono-inhabitants. That is, you cannot inhabit more than one place at a time. You cannot inhabit more than one place at a time. Second, nostalgia is of the order of time and memory. That's the second. And so when you are nostalgic, you are sitting in one place, inhabiting one place. I'm here sitting in front of you in Germany, and I yearn for the good old crowd I used to meet in Australia. That's not true, by the way, but still, you can take it as a kind of like nostalgia to Australia. I'm kind of like sitting here, but the idea, one, is that I'm only here, and I can only be here in Germany, in Halle, mono inhabitants. And the second thing is I have to use my memory, remembering the good old days when I was in Australia. And so nostalgia involved that fusion. So very interestingly, my exposure to something very different with relation to multiple ontological perspectivism, multiple realities, and my data started sort of like making me think some people were telling me actually not just that they were here and they're thinking about that. They actually were trying to say to me that they were in a number of places at the same time. And I could not initially try to think this idea. In fact, I thought it was a pretty, like, exotic idea, the idea that you can be simultaneously in Canada and in Lebanon. In fact, it's a sort of idea which you might think after you've had a nice joint and sort of like maybe a couple of beers and you start fantasizing your multiple realities, etc. Maybe, but the data, so came the idea of the lenticular. So this is the lenticular. The lenticular is, notice how the photo shifts. It's made out of, and I show you how you make a lenticular image here by creating a number of plates that you put one next to the other, and such as after a while you position them in such a way, and so you're seeing two photos. Now, what is important here about this notion of perspective that we are talking about with lenticular is that the multiplicity of realities is in the photo. It's not simply you see something in this differently when you look at it in a different way. It is when you are positioned differently, another part of reality comes to you. So reality itself embodies the multiplicity. And I kind of like very slowly moved from the simple mode of thinking lenticularity as 1, 2, 1, 2, to starting to think that actually it involves very interesting concepts of nostalgia here. So notice this photo is of a shop, of the old owner of the shop and the new, and the photo itself embodies both. That's the lenticular. The lenticular offers both. And what I was starting to move to was an idea that my informant was actually living in such realities. It's not that they were living in Canada and thinking about Lebanon. It was that their reality was a lenticular reality in which they were in Lebanon and they were in Canada. And what became much more important for me is the fact that when I started being able to think it not just in terms of angles, but in terms of affective intensities. And this is like the most, the art that I found most capable of capturing this. Because here you have different depths and different intensities, and reality is continuously creating various modes of reality protruding. It's an amazing visual, by the way. Gives you the sense of angle, depth, and so I want to invite you to think that this is how we inhabit reality. That any concept of reality as flat is actually a simplification of how we inhabit reality. And for me, something very similar was happening, i.e., I felt that my analysis of the diasporic condition allowed me to analyze lenticular modes of existence in a pronounced way, because this is how it is. But it allowed me to start sniffing lenticularity everywhere. Once I've done it there, I look and I see lenticularity everywhere. And I want to argue that this is an exoticization of the self, where you can actually bring anthropological knowledge and modes of existence and pluralize our sense and complicate our sense of what it means to exist in the world. Throughout its history, anthropology always moved between the two Aristotelian definitions of actuality and potentiality. To Aristotle, all reality was actuality and potentiality. Actuality involves practices and dispositions. If you want to analyze and do a prognosis of practices and dispositions of people, you're doing a sociology in the sense of that's what exists in front of you. Not as a discipline. Anthropologists, as I said, do it also. But the other side of anthropology is that it is out to sniff potentiality. It is that, what is a potentiality? A potentiality is something that exists, but is not existing in a full flowering form. It is existing in a potential state. Now, in a way, what we were describing as metonymic exoticization is precisely this idea that when you see a trace of something in reality and you say, this actually offers me access to something which is in reality but is not dominant. It's there. It's there in a potential state, etc. So the idea of anthropology as a potentialology, if you like, a potentialology, in the sense of it is a study of the potentials that reality offers. And you cannot see these potentials just because you are clever. It is hard work. You do the hard work of ethnography. It allows you to give you principles of perception, etc. This principle of perception allows you to see new things. You know, when I was a kid, I want to finish a little bit here because exoticism was not just about the past. When I was a kid, there was this exoticism of Japanese culture that I grew up on in the figure of Yoko Tsuno, which was this French cartoon character, which combined the best of Japanese exoticism, but also because in the 60s, Japan was also sort of like conceived as the techno wonderland, so there was also the exoticism of the future of what Japan. And so Yoko Tsuno was this amazing character, which, as you can see, on one hand, it had all the wonderful charm of exotic traditional Japan, but at the same time, she was cool, calm, collected, adventurer, and what's more, she was dealing with extraterrestrials and sort of like with high-tech stuff all the time. This is to highlight that exoticism is not necessarily directed to the past or nostalgic or necessarily about something that is warm and cuddly. It can be high-tech, etc. So it can be a metonymy of the future just as much as it is a metonymy of the past. And so in anthropology, we also want to capture metonymies of the future. We also want to try and see what potentialities the future has to offer. But at the same time, we have to ask whether the time when we used to think that the potentiality of a better time is still possible in the shadow of the Anthropocene. Can we think what is potentiality when it involves fantasies of sustainability, as opposed to fantasies of development and fantasies of better life, etc.? here the exotic becomes a kind of like lifeline. Maybe the exotic will give me a kind of like something I can hold on to while we are all collapsing. But at the most, the exotic in this logic can offer us also forms of what we call minor lives, which Eduardo Viveros de Castro calls beautifully, I think, modes of survival, because he thought that the very notion of survival, the sur, was already too optimistic for our era. That is, the idea of surviving still involves some form of human supremacy that we are still holding on to. And so can we have fantasies of not surviving, but surviving, being under, but continuing? These are the kind of challenges, it seems to me, that an anthropology of exoticization offers today. Thank you.